Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about biochemistry, which is the chemistry of life. Specifically, we're going to talk about organic chemistry today. We'll go over what does it mean to be organic, what are the different types of organic molecules out there, and what are some of the properties and functions of these organic molecules in life. So you can see examples of organic molecules are all the structures down here. We will not discuss any of these structures. These are way above the knowledge required in a biology class. All of this is organic chemistry, which most of you will never take in your life, and was probably the hardest class I ever took. So first off, what is organic molecules? So when something is organic, that means that it has a carbon. So organic molecules are made of mostly carbon, hydrogen, and their main job is they really determine the structure and function of all living things. So you can see some examples of some organic molecules: methane, isooctane, butadiene, acetylene, and benzene. The only one that you might have recognized maybe is methane. That is the gas that comes out of cows when they burp. The other ones, probably not something in your very common life. So once again, organic just means that you have carbon in it. So another word for organic molecule is also known as a macromolecule. So macro, the word part, means large. So a macromolecule is a large molecule that is made up of much smaller units. So macromolecules are molecules that are made from other subunits that are stuck together. These subunits are known as monomers. So monomers, mono means one. So a monomer is a single subunit. You combine these to form polymers because poly means many. These polymers are macromolecules. So a monomer is like an individual car of a train. You stick them together, you actually form the entire train, or the polymer. And the train would be a macromolecule. So you can see an example in the picture. The monomer units are these small individual subunits. You link them together and you form the polymer, which is the big long chain, or the macromolecule. So polymer, macromolecule, for your case, all macromolecules are polymers. So you'll need to know what is the actual building block of each macromolecule and what is the actual polymer that it makes. So you can see this is just an example of how you can, some polymers and some monomers. So you can see if you were to make this sugar here, maltose, it's two glucose together. So the glucose is a monomer. And then maltose is the polymer. And then you can do the opposite in this case. You have, once again, you have galactose and glucose. You're linking them together and you're forming one polymer of lactose, which is the sugar found in milk. The opposite can happen. Here you have the polymer sucrose, table sugar. That's what you put in your sweets. And using water, you can break that down into two monomers, glucose and fructose. So just a review of some stuff we talked about with water, because it does come back with some of the properties required of macromolecules. So remember, if you're polar, that means you have opposite ends, so you're positively and negatively charged. That means you're hydrophilic and you like water. If you're non-polar, that means you don't like water, you're hydrophobic, and you don't mix well with water. So some of the macromolecules we'll talk about are polar and hydrophilic. Other ones don't like water and are hydrophobic. This is important because remember that your cells are mostly water. 70 and 90% are actually water. So if you like water, you're going to interact differently in a watery environment than if you don't like water and you're hydrophobic. So it's really important when you're talking about chemistry, which we don't go into that much detail in, but the actual chemical reactions happening in your cells have to happen in water. And if you don't like water, what you can do is very different than if you're a molecule that does like water. There are four main macromolecules that you need to know. You have carbohydrates, which are the carbs. You have lipids or fats. You have proteins, which we all know are proteins. And you have nucleic acids. The rest of this video, I'm just going to discuss about carbohydrates and their properties and what you need to know about them. In the second video, we'll talk about proteins and nucleic acids. So one of the first things you need to know about carbohydrates is what they're actually made of. So carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. in a very specific ratio. All carbohydrates have this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, meaning 1 part carbon to 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen. So for every 1 carbon, there's 2 hydrogens. And so we say that carbohydrates are made of CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What is the actual function of carbohydrates? The main function of a carbohydrate is it's the main source of energy. So that's the main function. That's the reason why you love pasta and you love bread, is because that's what you're burning for most of your energy. Some of them are also used for structural purposes. In plants, it's used for the cell wall, so that's what supports it, so they don't fall down. But mostly, we're talking about it's a source of energy. That's the main thing you have to remember about carbohydrates and their function. What's the actual shape? They form ring structures. A ring does not mean a specific ring like this. Usually a ring will mean like a hexagon shape. That's not a hexagon. There we go. Hexagon shape. Or it could be a pentagon, depending on the sugar. We'll see some better drawings on the next page that aren't my terrible annotations. And finally, what are the actual building blocks? So the monomer unit, the building block of a carbohydrate, is known as a monosaccharide. Mono meaning one, saccharide means sugar. So these are the monomers. The building blocks of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. If you have 2 monosaccharides, we have a disaccharide, since di means 2. And if you stick multiple monosaccharides together, more than 2, they are called poly, because remember, poly means many, so polysaccharides. So monosaccharides are simple sugars like glucose, galactose, and fructose. Notice that there's only 1 ring, so this is the ring shape I'm talking about. Notice it kind of forms a ring if you squint a little bit, but it's that hexagon or that pentagon shape that we call a ring structure. So monosaccharides, you see there's 1 ring, so they're simple sugars. Polysaccharides are chains of these monomers stuck together. So you notice you have multiple subunits that are stuck together. So polysaccharides are polymers of monomers. Lipids. So the second macromolecule you need to know is lipids. So lipids are also known as fats, so that's why you have oil down here. So lipids are very varied in structure. However, one of the key characteristics of lipids are that they're hydrophobic. Remember, fat and water don't mix. So lipids, therefore, are nonpolar. Remember, hydrophobic means nonpolar. They do not mix well with water. What are they actually made of? They're made of CHO, just like carbohydrates are, which is an issue. If I say the following macromolecule is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, how do you know if it's a lipid? How do you know if it's a carbohydrate? Well, the key thing is that ratio. So with the carbohydrates, we said it had a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. With lipids, it has a greater than 2 to 1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. So it might be a 1 to 30 to 1 ratio. Any ratio of carbon to hydrogen and oxygen outside of 1 to 2 to 1 is going to be a lipid. So some examples, I mentioned they're fats, they're oils, they're phospholipids, which we'll come back to in a few weeks, talking about the cell membrane, waxes, wax paper, waxes on leaves. They're your steroids, which is kind of interesting for students, is the testosterone, estrogen hormones. They're actually made of lipids, they're modified cholesterol. Triglycerides, which if you ever get a blood test, they'll check your triglyceride level, which is one of the things that clogs arteries. And the infamous cholesterol is also a lipid. We'll talk about cholesterol in detail later, but cholesterol, while it gets a bad rap, it is actually needed in your cells for human survival. So what's the actual shape of a lipid? So the key shape is the tail structure. So lipids have a fatty acid chain or a CH tail. So when you're looking at something and you see these big long CH chains or these tails that stick off of it, those are characteristic shapes of lipids. So carbohydrates are rings, while lipids have these big long CH chains. I won't go into much detail, but you notice 2 words here, saturated and unsaturated. We talk about that with fat. You have saturated fats, which are unhealthy, and you have unsaturated fats, which are healthy for you, like olive oil, and butter is saturated. So these saturated ones are the ones that are solid at room temperature, like butter. These are the ones that clog your arteries. Notice that there's no double bonds. Saturated just means that you have this one double bond here, that's the only difference, and these guys actually stop heart disease from happening. What's the function of lipids? Lipids are there for long-term energy storage. So that's why when you eat too much, you get fat, because you're storing all that energy for later. If you eat it, your body is going to assume that you need it, so it's going to keep it for later. It's not just going to waste it. So it actually stores the most energy of all the macromolecules or the biomolecules out there. It's also found in your biological membranes or your cell membranes. So it's going to form the outside of your cell. It's going to be a waterproof covering. So if you're talking about a leaf or a stem, you want to make sure that water doesn't seep in and mess up the inside. So it actually is going to cover it. It can be a chemical messenger. We mentioned about steroids, estrogen, and testosterone, signaling whether to become a female or whether to become a male. Protection against heat loss, insulation. That's why in the Arctic you see animals that are fat, because they're going to use that blubber layer to keep all the heat in.